Hi again. If you've ever watched a nature show, you may have been struck by the huge diversity of life on Earth. Life is found everywhere, from deep-sea hydrothermal vents to some of the coldest places on Earth. And each organism is unique, and they can vary hugely in how they look, in where they live, in how they take in nutrients, how they get and use energy, etc. And when you think about the fact that most of the organisms on Earth we can't even see, well, the diversity is endless. And yet, all organisms on Earth share some common characteristics. So why is that, and how do we explain both the unity and the diversity of life on Earth? Well, one of the most significant biological theories ever proposed is the theory of evolution. It helps us make sense of the life around us, and it explains so much about what we see in nature. And believe it or not, in my opinion, the best evidence for evolution comes from looking at cells, learning about what they're made of and how they work. So this next lecture is going to look at what all life has in common, and then it's going to introduce the theory of evolution as a context within which we can better understand the material we'll be covering in this course. So let's get going. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the characteristics of life, evolution, and cell theory. And before I get started, just a friendly reminder about copyright. All recordings and images are for personal use only. They should not be downloaded, sold, shared, or distributed in any way. In addition, all material associated with this course, whether it's lecture recordings like this, quizzes, laboratory work, etc., are for personal study purposes only. Unauthorized distribution in any form can lead to a violation under Canadian copyright law or academic misconduct charges under the York University Senate policy. Now, a piece of advice before we begin the actual lecture. Throughout these lectures, I'm going to be asking you questions. And so to get the most out of the lectures and to make them a real learning experience, I'm asking you to engage with me when I pose a question. So pause the video and actually take the time to think about and answer my questions. It's a good idea to keep a paper and pencil with you as you're listening to the lectures, in order to take notes, of course, but also to answer these questions that I'm posing. Even if you have no idea what the answer is, the act of stopping, thinking, and writing about it will help you enormously with recalling information. It may deepen your understanding of the material, and it will certainly support the movement of concepts and information into your long-term memory. So just take a minute here and take a look at the images. All of these images contain a mix of things, some of which are living and some which are not alive. And I'll bet that you can identify immediately which things are alive and which things are not. And if you think about this for a minute as you're looking at these images, ask yourself, what is it about what's alive that allows me to recognize it immediately as being alive? What characteristics make living things different from non-living things? So again, stop the video for a minute and think about what characteristics would you say that all life share in common. Now, I'm guessing that probably you all have created slightly different lists, but I'll bet almost all of you have chosen this characteristic as something that all living things share. So all life has to reproduce. Your text refers to this characteristic as replication, but usually we call it reproduction. So most organisms exist to reproduce, and enormous amounts of their energy, their physiology, their behavior is dedicated to reproduction, whether you're talking about a bacterium or a human or even a tree. Another common characteristic that all living organisms share relates to energy and metabolism. So life depends on energy. All organisms must have a way to get and to use energy in order to carry out the processes of life. That includes building the molecules that will make up their bodies, whether we're talking about one cell or a billion cells. Also breaking down those molecules and getting rid of waste. And all of these processes make up what is known as metabolism. So metabolism is intimately connected to energy and energy transformation. Another common characteristic you might have thought about, probably not using this word, is information. Organisms must have a way of storing and using information, and there are different kinds of information. For example, information about what they are and what they're made of, in other words, genetic information, our genome or genes, as well as a way of expressing that genetic information and replicating it to pass on to the next generation. They must also be able to receive and interpret information that comes from their environment. So you might again pause and think for a minute about how different organisms take in information from their environment. And take a moment to think about your own body and all of the different parts of your body that are involved in receiving information from your external environment. When you're talking about multicelled organisms as well, multicelled organisms also must have ways of receiving information from different parts of their own body. And you can think for a minute about what parts of your own physiology are linked to the receiving and sending of information to different parts of your body. Organisms have to be able to detect information from the environment for a reason. And that's because, in many cases, they need to respond to that information. So response is another critical characteristic of life. In order to stay alive, organisms must be able to respond to information gathered from their environment. So you might think for a minute about some examples of response. Again, pause the video for a minute while you think about and make a list of ways in which organisms can respond to their environment or to signals or information that come from their environment. Many of you likely thought immediately about movement. So if you have a rabbit that detects the presence of a wolf nearby, there's going to be an immediate response of moving away from that wolf. Clearly, movement is an obvious form of response, but there are other ways that an organism can respond to a change in or information from its environment, such as a change of metabolism or a change in gene expression, and also, something you might not have thought about, evolution. So evolution is actually a species or a population's response to changes in the environment. This is a response that doesn't happen at the individual level, but rather at the level of a population or a species. And we'll talk more about that later on in this lecture. Finally, I'm not sure how many of you will have thought of this one, but if you think about the basic structure of all life, you might recall that all living organisms are made of membrane-bound cells. And this makes the cell the basic unit of life. Consequently, understanding cells really means understanding life. So all life is cellular. Whether you're a bacterium, a plant, a mushroom, a human, you're all made up of one or more cells. And you might think of this particular idea as not that interesting and not that controversial. But that was not always the case. And in fact, the concept that all life is made of cells forms one of the cornerstone theories and unifying ideas in biology. So modern cell theory has three major principles. First, all life is composed of one or more cells. Second, this makes cells the basic unit of life. So cells are the smallest unit that have all the properties of life. And thirdly, all cells come from pre-existing cells. Now this last point is actually really important, and we're going to come back to it in a minute. But before we do that, you might be saying, and why do we call this a theory? Well, what does it mean when a biologist uses the word theory? It turns out that theory has a special meaning in science, which is different from the way we use it in everyday life. In everyday use, theory often means a guess or an untested speculation. For example, you might wake up one morning and find that your cell phone's not working. And that might lead you to speculate on why it's not working so that you can try to fix it. And you might say to yourself, my theory is that the cell phone is not working because the battery is dead. Well, in science, that would not be considered a theory. That would be considered an hypothesis, an educated guess based on your knowledge of how the cell phone works and your past experience with cell phones. In science, theories are much more important than an hypothesis. A theory is a broad explanation for something based on many lines of evidence. So theories aid in the generation of new hypotheses, which leads to additional research and the gathering of new knowledge and understanding. A theory is something that has withstood rigorous scientific testing. So that means that when something becomes a theory in science, it's an important concept or explanation, and it's well supported by evidence. And that means that we're pretty confident in its accuracy. So if you go back then to cell theory and this notion that all living organisms are made of cells, we have seen this time and time again. Whenever we investigate a living organism, we find that it's made up of cells. Hence our confidence and our use of theory when we talk about cell theory. So if we go back to modern cell theory then, and this third element, that all cells come from pre-existing cells. Think about that for a minute. What does that mean, and what characteristic does this relate to when you think about the other characteristics of life? So you may want to pause the recording for a minute and go back to the slide on the characteristics of life and think about which one of those characteristics relates to the notion that all cells come from pre-existing cells. How do they relate? I hope you've paused for a minute and done some thinking. For me, when I think of all cells coming from pre-existing cells, I immediately think of reproduction and the continuity of life. So cells don't just appear out of nowhere. They're generated by cell division, and that means that every cell in your body comes from a pre-existing cell that divided at one time. And you can trace all of your own cells back to one original cell. And which cell would that be? Think for a minute. I hope you're all thinking the fertilized egg. And where did the fertilized egg come from? It also came from cells. I'm sure most of you will know that it came from two cells that came together, an egg cell and a sperm cell. Now you might also trace the ancestry of your egg and sperm that made you. Where did those two cells come from? You can continue to trace back the ancestries of your own cells in this way, back to a point perhaps even before humans existed. So if you take this idea that all cells come from pre-existing cells, and our understanding from the fossil record and other sources that humans and many other organisms that exist today on Earth did not always exist here, this logically follows that all organisms on Earth share common ancestry. And if that is true, then how did we get to this moment when we have this diversity of organisms on Earth that did not always exist? How would you explain that observation? I'm hoping that some of you are thinking of evolution, and that brings us to the second major unifying theory in biology, the theory of evolution. Now, your textbook describes evolution as a change in the characteristics of a population over time. So we're talking about change, and we're talking about not individual changes, but changes in groups of organisms or populations. Another element in the theory of evolution is the notion that characteristics of populations or species can be modified from generation to generation. But how does this modification happen? Well, if we're talking about characteristics or traits, we really mean heritable traits or genetic traits. So we're really talking about genes here. And the geneticists define evolution as changes in allele frequencies. Another element of the theory of evolution is that all species are related by common ancestry, and it explains the observation that we've made that some species disappear through time while new ones emerge over time. Now, one of the major questions that concerns evolutionary biologists is how. How does evolution actually happen? What's the mechanism for evolutionary change? And it's generally accepted that one of the major forces or mechanisms for evolution is selection. Now, before we move on to talk a bit about selection and natural selection, I mentioned a word here that maybe some of you have forgotten, and that is allele. So let me pose a question to you. What exactly are alleles? So take a minute, pause this video, and answer the question by choosing one of the 4 different answers on the right-hand side of the slide. Now, if you chose A, different forms of a gene, you're correct. So when we're talking about alleles, we're talking about different forms of the same gene. And if that doesn't make a lot of sense to you, we'll be diving even deeper into what alleles are much later in the course. Now, I mentioned that evolution occurs in populations. So what do I mean when I say population? If you look at how organisms are organized on Earth, you start with single individual organisms. Groups of organisms of the same species form populations. Different populations of organisms come together to form communities. Different communities come together to form ecosystems. And if you take all of the ecosystems on Earth, you'll form the biosphere. So a population then refers not to individual organisms, but to groups of organisms. These are groups of individuals from the same species that live in the same area at the same time. So when we talk about evolution of populations, we're talking about changes within a group of individuals from the same species. So what exactly is meant by selection? Well, let's start by taking a look at this graph. This graph shows the percent of ICU patients that had vancomycin-resistant infections of Staphylococcus aureus, which is a common bacterium that causes skin and respiratory infections, in U.S. hospital intensive care units through the 1980s and 90s. So what does this graph tell you? Once again, take a little pause, look carefully at the graph, and try and describe what it tells you in one sentence. So if you were a journalist and you had to describe this graph to your readers, what would you write? Here's what I would write. Something like, between 1989 and 2001, the percentage of ICU patients with vancomycin-resistant infections of Staphylococcus aureus in American intensive care units increased from 0 to 30%. And you can see this when you look at the graph's data. So through the 1980s, there are no reports of vancomycin-resistant bacteria, and then those reports from hospitals start to come up in the 1990s, and they reach about 30% of cases by 2001. So vancomycin is an antibiotic, and what we appear to be seeing here is the emergence of vancomycin resistance in bacteria in hospitals. Another way to describe this is that bacteria are evolving antibiotic resistance through the 1990s in hospitals. But how is this happening and why? It turns out that the use of vancomycin in hospitals rose dramatically in the US during the 1980s and into the 90s. And as you see that rise in use of vancomycin, you also see the emergence of vancomycin-resistant strains of bacteria. And this phenomenon can easily be explained as an example of natural selection. The idea of selection was proposed by Charles Darwin in his book called The Origin of Species, which was published in the late 19th century. It was also developed independently by another scientist named Alfred Russel Wallace. It was Darwin who coined the term natural selection. And what exactly does he mean by natural selection? How does natural selection work? Darwin first observed that individuals are always unique, and each individual within a population or a species is slightly different from its fellow members. These individual differences can be passed on from generation to generation, and so they're heritable traits. And this genetic variation is the basis on which selection acts. So individuals have different heritable traits. Selection then is going to act on these differences in heritable traits among individuals. So in any environment, different heritable traits may make an individual more or less suited to that particular environment, which would lead to differential survival and reproduction. Those individuals with characteristics that increase the ability of the organism to survive and reproduce will be more likely to be passed on to the next generation, and will be passed on more often or more frequently as a result of leaving more offspring in the next generation. Similarly, those individuals with characteristics that decrease the ability of that organism to survive and reproduce will be less likely to be passed on to the next generation, or will be passed on less frequently because that individual will be less successful at surviving and reproducing. So they're leaving fewer offspring in the next generation. So selection involves differential survival and reproduction. In a particular environment, certain traits may lead to increased success, in producing successful offspring, and other traits may lead to decreased success in producing successful offspring. And so alleles are passed on at different frequencies into the next generation. The population changes, and by definition, this is evolution. So let's go back now to our example of antibiotic resistance. Can we explain this emergence of resistant strains as a result of the process of selection? Well, another way to describe this graph is to say that we're seeing an increase in the frequency of an antibiotic resistance gene in this population of bacteria over time. And how can we explain this through selection? Well, let's take a look at the images down here below. Let us say at the very beginning, say in the late 1980s, we have a population of bacteria which are largely sensitive to vancomycin. So if you add vancomycin to this population of bacteria shown here, the bulk of them are going to die because most of them are very sensitive to vancomycin. It disrupts their metabolism and they die. But within this population, as always, will be some genetic variation. And let's say that inside this population of bacteria, there's one individual that by chance happens to have an allele which confers antibiotic resistance on that individual. So when you add antibiotics to this bacterial population, the vast majority of these bacteria will die. These are the purple bacteria, which are normal. But the one individual bacterium, which is shown in orange, which is resistant to vancomycin, will survive. So now we come to a situation where most of the individuals that were sensitive to vancomycin are gone. Maybe one or two of them persisted by chance again. Perhaps they were exposed to a little bit less of the antibiotic, or they were a little bit more resistant to the antibiotic, but not fully resistant. And so you're left with a different population now. You've got two individuals left. So now 50% of this population of bacteria are resistant and 50% are sensitive to vancomycin. If you continue to grow this population in the presence of vancomycin, over time you'll have more and more of the individuals in this population vancomycin resistant, and fewer of these individuals vancomycin sensitive, because in the presence of vancomycin, the sensitive ones are dying off. Eventually, you have a population where all of the bacteria in this environment are vancomycin resistant. This is the evolution of a vancomycin resistant strain of bacteria. How did this happen? Did all of the bacteria who were sensitive to vancomycin decide, wow, I have a problem, I better evolve some resistance here? And did those individuals change? And the answer is no, right? The individuals that were sensitive to vancomycin simply died. They were selected out. And the individuals that were resistant survived because they were selected for, because they had a genetic difference that allowed them to survive in the presence of vancomycin. So what we're seeing here is selection. The selection for a particular trait, in this case vancomycin resistance, and the selection against another type of trait, which is vancomycin sensitivity. There is no miracle here. There is no magic. It's simply natural selection. It happens naturally. Just to reiterate, one starts with variation in a population. Those variations must be heritable. They must be genetically based, something that can be passed on. Often, when the environment changes, you'll see differential survival and reproduction among the individuals within the population. And there will be a change in frequency of selected traits in the next generation. Some traits that increase survival and successful reproduction will be selected for, and traits which decrease survival and reproduction are selected against. And that leads over time to a change in the traits of the population or the allele frequencies in the population, and that means evolution has occurred. So just a few things to remember about selection. The key here is to survive, to pass on your genes to the next generation. In order for evolution to occur, the organism must successfully reproduce. So you can be the best survivor in the world. If you can't pass your genes to the next generation, you're not going to contribute to evolutionary change. Individuals survive or don't survive. So evolution does not occur at the level of the individual. It's populations that evolve. And selection is directed by circumstances. Selection happens often when there's a change in the environment. As circumstances change, this can affect the direction of selection. So what is a really good trait or useful trait or successful trait in one set of circumstances may be a really bad trait or unsuccessful trait when these circumstances change. And just one more point about selection, not all selection is natural selection. Humans have been breeding animals and plants for thousands of years, taking advantage of this simple yet powerful mechanism of evolution, and we call that artificial selection. So if we just stop for a minute and reflect, we've discussed two major unifying theories of biology today: cell theory and the theory of evolution. Both include a pattern of observation and a mechanism to explain that pattern of observation. Now, if we look at these two unifying theories for a moment, I'd like you to reflect a little bit on them and see if you can see any connections between them, something that ties them together. For me, the common theme that emerges is really common ancestry. So if you consider cell theory for a moment, we discussed earlier how all cells come from pre-existing cells, and you can sort of follow those and you can follow the ancestry of any given cell back into time. So all cells in a multicellular organism, as we already discussed, descend from a single ancestral cell, and all organisms in a population descend from a common ancestor. This concept of common ancestry ties directly, of course, to the theory of evolution. So all species are related by descent from a common ancestor, and all species come or descend from pre-existing species. Just a couple of final points. Let's move this discussion now into thinking about the unity and diversity of life. So one of the most important LOs, or learning outcomes, I think, for this course is to be able to explain how both the unity and the diversity of life can be explained by the theory of evolution. So although all of life on Earth is incredibly diverse, as we've been talking about, they all share common traits. So for example, if we take a look at different mammals, humans, cats, whales, and bats, they all look very different. They all have different forms of life. And yet many aspects of their structure and their metabolism, etc., are the same. How do you explain this unity and this similarity across these different species? Well, it comes back to the fact that all organisms alive today descended from a common ancestor. And we see this evidence for common ancestry when we look at the details of different groups of organisms. At the same time, we recognize that there's enormous diversity of life on Earth, and that also can be explained through evolution. So species do change over time as a result of mechanisms or forces such as natural selection, and it's evolution itself that can give rise to huge diversity, including the emergence of new species. So that wraps up our lecture for today, and coming up we're going to start exploring the unity and diversity of life at the cell level.